Thanks for tuning in to Liberación Army Radio. This is episode 5 of our podcast. This episode is slated to release on April 21st, 2025. Today we'll be talking about leaked 4chan documents, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, Katy, Perry, and Gayle King on the 11-minute Blue Origin flight in space, and the Puerto Rico blackout. For international politics, we'll go over the U.S. airstrikes on Yemen and the evolving genocide in Gaza. In Mexico, we'll talk about the U.S. tomato situation and the Bienestar stores. Finally, we'll finish our two-part general topic, the enemies of the left. Tune in to our previous episode for part 1.
Let's jump right into it. For domestic events, I'm sure you've heard of the 4chan documents being exposed.
What's going on with the 4chan documents is that there were a variety of IP addresses that were leaked and past users that were leaked. 4chan, are you familiar with what it is?
It's kind of like a anonymous forum, right?
Yeah, a lot of people call it like the worst version of Reddit, but actually 4chan came before Reddit did. 4chan is this image board and also a forum. Every meme that you've ever come into contact with has its roots somewhere on 4chan. Not only was it exposed that a bunch of people in the government were basically involved in 4chan, Hasbara, which is the Israeli propaganda program, they and the Israeli military online bot farm have manufactured a bunch of posts to post on the political board on 4chan. After the IP addresses and various other pass users were leaked, by the way, pass users are people who are able to skip putting in a CAPTCHA code when putting in sort of like, okay, so a CAPTCHA is not the same thing as a regular CAPTCHA in this situation as it is on 4chan. So a CAPTCHA code is kind of like a username. Most image boards like 4chan, there's a few like 2chan and such. Most of these other boards, they're completely anonymous, and you actually have to put an effort to give yourself a username. Usernames for 4chan are CAPTCHA codes. They're basically like generated codes that sometimes have an actual tag behind them. Past users, they're able to skip putting in a CAPTCHA and they can have like an actual just username, and they're able to report posts more easily. So they're essentially the 4chan version of premium users. And the leaked document exposed a bunch of IP addresses and potentially some pass users, some 4chan pass users. They were exposed by a competitor offshoot of 4chan called Soyjack Party. They basically do those memes of that guy that's wearing the glasses that's like crying all the time. It's like that hand-drawn illustration meme. That meme is called Soyjack. Because they're a competitor of 4chan, they leaked a bunch of documents. Among that leak, there was some inklings that Elon Musk's account may have been leaked as well. And I want to direct you to the Reddit page. People are claiming that the username the Antichrist, this was also an allegation made by the Tribune, not just this 4chan user who posted screenshots of comments that the Antichrist posted. But the Tribune posted that Elon Musk's CAPTCHA might have been the Antichrist. As you can see, like the CAPTCHA, it's like a bunch of generated numbers as well. You see after that. So here are some of the things that are interesting that are in this. So on the 8th screenshot by this Reddit user, you'll see that basically the Antichrist posted on September 11th, 2024, the name of Doge before Doge itself was officially formed. This is why a lot of people think that this account could be connected to Elon Musk, as well as, honestly, a lot of these comments are very much like ahead of their time in terms of it potentially being Elon Musk. And the other thing is that a lot of people also think that his other account is called Kekius Maximus, which is in here as well. And he has a simultaneous Twitter account that's also called Kekius Maximus, which is in a reference to Pepe the Frog. And there's also like a whole thread, basically a few screenshots in, where they're telling Elon Musk to jump for him to help Trump cinch the presidency during the elections. And then There's like a video posted after of Elon Musk jumping at the Trump rally. And this is like dialogue that's happening before these events are happening. That's why a lot of people think that.
I see. Do you think he would have conducted himself differently if he knew he was going to get caught on 4chan?
No. I think Elon Musk is a billionaire. And I think that at that time he was kind of like riding a wave that was very like he was at the peak of Tesla and getting everything that he wanted. Rich people are the kind of people that when they achieve a certain level of wealth, they really don't care what they do as long as they feel something. You
Mm,
can kind of see like that at a certain point they get bored because they have done everything that there is to do. It requires a level of like willingness to exploit your fellow man to become that rich, right? So I don't think that he would have necessarily conducted himself differently. In fact, I think like the risk is a part of the appeal for a lot of these alt-right wealthy types. And he's also like the child of an apartheid South African. So I don't think that he's worried about coming across as racist because he's actually just racist. And of course, a lot of the comments under this account, the Antichrist, are found to say like really anti Semitic things. And one of the comments was him basically saying that like he wanted a alt right monarchy for the United States.
mm. I mean, the other thing I'm wondering too is if they can confirm that Elon is this user, would do you think this would implicate any of his positions in government?
I think that him potentially being on 4chan is not really a mystery. Whether or not he's essentially come out and said that he's democratized among a bunch of alt right weirdos what he's to do in government is another question altogether. Like, I don't think that he's necessarily exposed that he's done that. But he does. What I do think that the bigger issue will be is who his affiliates are,
Mm,
who is going to be exposed. Because I think it's going to be surprising when a lot of liberals are on that list, particularly types like Gavin Newsom and people who have more recently been platforming alt-right political leaders. I think that what that implies is that the government is the way that it is because it's racist.
Well, there's definitely other politicians on 4chan.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
And police
this is just the
officers.
the tip of the iceberg.
I really can't understate that like 4chan is the underbelly of the internet.
Hmm.
It's quite literally like the step before the actual dark web. You can see snuff content on there. You can see rape content on there. You can see there were a few cases that were solved as a result of murders being posted on 4chan. There was one particular video of a woman that like was stepping on the head of a kitten with her high heel on there. A
I think there was
very
a documentary about that
yeah, it's
on
called
Netflix.
I think it's called
Don't fuck with cats.
yeah, I think it's called Don't Fuck with Cats
Yeah,
on Netflix. If you wanna see more about like the things that people do on 4chan. There are a few different news outlets reporting that it might be dead for good. As of this podcast, 4chan has been down for the last couple days.
thank God. Good riddance. It's about
Yeah.
about time, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked a little bit about this before, but I've been attacked by 4chan users before, and it was pretty bad. Like they had my address. I was, 17 getting literal hate mail from grown men.
People are really bold under the guise of anonymity.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
And yeah, anyway, this is the root of a lot of really gross things that happen in our society. And what's interesting is that I also saw a lot of memes coming out of this with people saying like where the 4chan users migrate to is going to be problematic for the general public. And I'm like, these people who are on 4chan, first of all, if they're regular civilians, they need to be exposed to regular people.
Yeah.
They need
That's
to
true.
they need to be exposed to regular people. Because their ideology needs to change. And the rest of the people that are on there are very, very wealthy or they're political elites. They are not coming onto those spaces in the same capacity. They control those spaces. They
Mm.
control all of their social media. I hope that a lot of these people actually do get outside, touch grass, and maybe actually learn to talk to women. Most of the advice that they're being given is to like be dominant and abusive towards women. I thought it was a really interesting story. And
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I'm sure we'll see this continue to develop.
the other thing is that it's kind of being kept under wraps. Not a lot of news media outlets are reporting on it. I didn't see anything from mainstream media except for the Tribune,
It's
basically
because there's some really rich people on there that don't want to be
found.
discovered. You know, they're definitely putting some money into this.
Oh, yeah, IP addresses.
Any updates on Kilmar?
Kilmar Abrego Garcia just met with Senator Chris Holland of Maryland under the supervision of the Salvadoran government. All that means is that he's alive. But Nayib Bukele, immediately after the meeting, posted this tweet mocking the situation.
I'll start with the initial one. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, miraculously risen from the quote death camps and quote torture, now sipping margaritas with Senator Van Hollen in the tropical paradise of El Salvador. And then he responded to his own post saying, now that he's been confirmed healthy, he gets the honor of staying in El Salvador's custody. American flag, handshake emoji, El Salvador flag.
Nayib Bukele is gross for posting that. And we talked a little bit about this last week. The thing that's remarkable about this case is that Trump is directly defying a Supreme Court ruling, and he's doing it in such a way that like potentially is causing a constitutional crisis. As of this podcast, there's been a American citizen that's been detained illegally by ICE and put into a detention camp here locally, but was released I think the same day. But that's like a really big deal. Whenever I talk about cases like these, I want to remind people that fear is useful as a motivator. It should not keep you at home. Get connected with local nonprofits, especially migration nonprofits. If you can't find an immediate access point to any activist organizations that are doing any kind of direct action immediately or in the very near future, I highly encourage you to get connected with the university because students generally tend to lead these movements. So I highly encourage you to find out and see what's going on in your local area because it's important not to just talk about these things as in the context of how scary they are. It's important to talk about what we can do to get at the actual problem itself.
Did you spell her name like that on purpose?
I did.
Okay. I'm sure we've all seen this story in the news recently. Katy, Perra, and Gayle King in space.
The only thing that really struck me about this is that Katy Perry goes into space and she's going with a few other people as well as Gayle King. They're only in space for 11 minutes on this Blue Origin flight. It generates a horrible carbon footprint. They're not doing any actual research, by the way, in space. But when asked, Gayle King was saying that she was doing research, and she said, quote, it's to figure out a way to harness the waste here and put it in space to make the Earth a better place.
She said, forget about American centrism. We're gonna do Earth centrism now.
Well, and I said this too. I was like, this is American colonialism
Mm-hmm.
going intergalactic. I hate to harp on this point. First, we know that there's life forms, alien life forms. And I said this in my TikTok video, but can you imagine being an alien life form and then just being colonized by a American trash asteroid? I just think people, Americans in particular, are not used to resolving problems for the sake of resolving them. And I think Gayle King is being obtuse, intentionally obtuse, when it comes to saying that they were doing anything of use out in space.
Yeah, I'm just like, why lie? You know, just be honest about their little field trip.
And it was $700,000 for a ticket.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Damn.
money that could be spent doing a million other things, including solving the climate crisis.
Right.
Not by spending trash and not by sending trash into space, but by cleaning our atmosphere, cleaning the actual air, reducing carbon emissions rather than increasing them. Like there's a million things that need to be done for the climate crisis right now. I just really don't respect the choice to go to space. And a lot of people are making the comparison to Although Marie Antoinette never actually said this, but a lot of people are comparing it to the let them eat cake false quote.
Mm,
It kind of has the same energy. Some people have been making comparisons to the Hunger Games and like the luxuries that are happening at the Capitol, and basically like the Capitol watching the Hunger Games, but this
mm,
time the Capitol is watching the Hunger Games from space.
totally. I wish they had just left them up there. I mean, $700,000. I know it sounds like a lot, but Jeff Bezos does not need that money.
Oh no.
I'm curious as to why he put a price tag on it anyway.
It's also honestly such a slap in the face to astronauts who have been studying, who are actually looking for ways to improve the Earth's quality and the quality of life here on planet Earth by studying space. Not to mention that a lot of astronauts are dedicating their life to finding ways to terraform other planets, particularly Mars. We know that our government is basically egging us on into a third world war, which could mean a total loss of planet Earth.
Hmm.
Like I just think it's like a combination of they're their own perpetrators of this, and they are the ones who are doing the harm to the planet in the first place, and the only reason that anybody would have to investigate trash in space is because of the amount of trash that Amazon produces. By the way, Blue Origin is associated with Amazon.
Yeah,
So so the whole thing is just like the statement itself is such a like closed loophole of billionaire degeneracy
yeah.
that yeah, it just made me feel away.
They're really out of touch,
Yeah,
billionaires.
really really out of touch.
All right, Puerto Rico. What was it? The blackout.
So the blackout itself affected 1.4 million people, and over 400,000 people were out without water. What the Puerto Rican population, as well as the Puerto Rican government, is saying is that there are a couple energy companies that are specifically responsible for the situation. The blackout itself didn't last very long, but it did affect hospitals, which can obviously be life threatening for a lot of people. Having a blackout is one thing, but having a whole blackout throughout the majority of the country is just really, really dangerous, especially when it starts to affect hospitals, especially when it starts to affect places where like people need that electricity to survive. So they haven't reported on any deaths. Thankfully, we haven't heard anything about that, but it was pretty bad. And of course, this is predatory companies that are doing what they're doing.
Hmm.
But that's what's going on with Puerto Rico. I wanted to ask you about Palestine, Congo, Sudan, and Yemen.
I'll start with Yemen. Friday, April 18th, the U.S. military bombed a fuel port in Yemen, killing more than 70 people and injuring about 150. And among the casualties, they had quite a few rescue workers and paramedics too. Because the intention with the bombing was to eliminate a fuel source, but the reality is they did it in a way to almost kill as many people as possible. They did it while people were working, during the day. And it's a pretty critical port. A lot of Yemen's imports and their humanitarian assistance goes through that port. So it's a pretty deadly attack.
I think this is interesting because this is a clear-cut war crime. They're sending in like airstrikes to fight with a group of people who are wearing sandals, basically, and very, very rudimentary weapons. Also, the Houthis are mostly being accused of what they're being accused of because they're causing a blockade on Israeli imports of weapons. That's why they're being attacked. If you are fighting with a nuclear weapon versus somebody who has some sticks, that's disproportionate,
Hmm.
and that is genocide, especially when there's other elements as well, like any kind of sanctions, which Yemen has been hit with by a variety of Western countries. And Yemen is also like not supported really by any other countries. A lot of the American politicians like to say that the Houthis are backed by Iran, but they're not really backed by anyone. They don't really have a lot of money. They're a very poor country. So the attacks on Yemen are, especially when they're like ports like this, they're very clear cut war crimes.
Hmm.
And of course, the United States empire is going to continue to try to hide that it's criminal activity. But if the United Nations International Court wasn't so biased in the favor of the United States, this would be an open and shut case of a war crime.
Mm. It's kind of wild to think that there are ethics with war. Like there's an ethical way to wage war, but that is the place that we are, unfortunately.
There's a lot of history here. The statement that you're making. World War One didn't have ethics, codes of ethics, and that's actually where we saw the inventions of like gas and chemical attacks on people. Previous to that, though, most weapons were pretty symmetrical by the nature of the fact that like the inventions hadn't happened yet.
Mm.
So it isn't until after World War One that nukes really start to get developed. Warfare starts being used for real, like
Mm.
in what we would consider quote modern society, like after the Industrial Revolution, really. So we start to see like mechanized evolutions of weapons of war, but also the mentality around war had begun to shift. So that's like what makes it also different.
Mm.
That people were thinking about war in the context of hoping to end having to have war at all.
Mm.
So this is why organizations started popping up. Before the United Nations, there was the League of Nations. So the League of Nations was established in 1919 after World War One under the Treaty of Versailles. They were like, we want to promote peace and security amongst all nations. I think 11 different countries that were in the League of Nations. After the League of Nations failed to stop certain, there was a bunch of stuff that happened, but basically after they failed to stop a bigger conflict and a genocide, they rebranded to the United Nations, and it has they're the three primary states of the United Nations, and they have infinite veto power. They can veto anything,
Huh.
and that's China, Russia, and the United States. Almost all the states have to come and consult with them to get anything done, legally speaking. And they, of course, also set the ethics of war, which obviously is very stilted.
Mm-hmm.
The whole purpose of the United Nations is to essentially figure out a way to stop war from becoming genocide, and to ensure that war is at least somewhat symmetrical. There's no planet on which the United States gets into a conflict with another country that could be symmetrical, because the United States always has more military power. And unfortunately, the United States tends to attack countries that are in the global south. I recommend taking an ethics and war class if you want to learn more about that. I don't think I'm the best person to talk about that. That's a whole other subfield inside of
Mm.
international politics,
Yeah.
is ethics and war.
Speaking about war and genocide, there was yet another attack on Gaza today by Israeli military on a few homes, a few tents, and even a barbershop, among other locations. Just today, the death toll came up to 64 civilians. Most of them were children this time.
Yeah, the attacks on Gaza have been escalating, and
Do you want to talk about Congo, Sudan?
uh, the gist of what's going on in Congo is that we don't know that anything has evolved drastically because there's a huge media blackout. A similar situation is going on with Sudan. We're still in the same situation as we were last week, as to my knowledge. I haven't heard a lot else. Okay, so the last episode that we had any changes was the March 31st episode, which was episode 2 of our podcast. So if you want to know more about what resources to find in terms of how to learn more about Sudan and Congo, I posted the links of a bunch of different social media users who are people who have connections to Focus Congo, which is a on the ground organization working out of Congo specifically and providing humanitarian aid, as well as a few TikTokers that are talking about Sudan. So basically, we're in the same position as we were in the past.
All right. Updates? Any updates on Mexican politics?
Have you heard about the tomato crisis?
I have not.
So, Florida is basically accusing Mexico of dumping tomatoes into the US market to undercut the prices of Floridian tomatoes. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, she stated that tomato production in the US is unmatched by Florida in terms of quality and quantity, because the Floridian climate actually can't compete with the tomatoes that are produced in Sinaloa specifically. which is where the majority of the tomatoes are being produced out of Mexico. The American government didn't notify Mexico that they were going to be ending a agreement between Mexico and the United States. This agreement is called the suspension agreement. It basically makes a case that if Mexico is going to export tomatoes into the US, that the US won't tax them. It kind of falls into under the other trade agreement under NAFTA. Because they're ending the suspension agreement, it's essentially going to be like tomatoes are being tariffed. That's how it's going to be felt.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
I'm glad we're growing our own tomatoes.
Yeah. Tomatoes taste like water when they're made in the United States. All those like Roma tomatoes, all those like bright red, very watery tomatoes, those are all produced in Florida. Especially because Mexico has regulation against genetically modified foods.
Mm.
So just the quality of Mexican tomatoes is a lot better. It's significantly better. I mean, you've eaten in Mexico. The food quality is a lot more improved. I find that American tomatoes are not very good. They're just not very good quality.
It's really interesting. I think this is partially, I think the U.S. is moving. They're trying to move towards producing everything domestically, but it's just not realistic to do that.
It makes sense. There's a few ideological approaches to capitalism that American foreign policy observes. One of them is called realism, and realism would basically argue that the United States is a protectionist country. Protectionism basically just means that the United States is going to move to protect domestic markets. And the way that it tends to do that is by trying to force American consumers to consume products domestically.
Mm.
What that practically means, though, is manufacturing in the United States, which, A, Americans don't want to manufacture things. Americans don't want to do that kind of work
It's true.
in general. That's why most of that work is left up to migrants. And then on top of that, most manufacturing is better in China. So it just doesn't make sense when it comes to non agricultural products for the United States to try to manufacture it.
Mm.
Also, liberals, which is a different ideological approach to capitalism and foreign policy, would argue that increasing interdependence, meaning making people trade more as a result of the free market, makes states a lot less likely to be violent
Mhm.
because they rely on each other economically, right? Which makes a lot of sense. And then, of course, the ideological separation here, the one that I like to adopt is a communist stance, which is that things should be nationalized and free trade should happen in between countries, especially countries that have surplus of products that they make, or if they have something that's like native to the area, so that there's no ecological consequences of trade. Right now, people try to produce things in areas where they're not native to, which
Mhm.
creates invasive species. So it doesn't make sense to have a protectionist or a liberal approach to free market trade because it's not really free. Most of the time it's exploitative. And anyway, this is what happens is that the regular people have to pay money because of this dated concept of protectionism.
Yeah, it's true. Sure, everybody's already starting to notice that their grocery bill is getting higher.
Oh yeah.
Their gas bill is starting to get higher too.
Yeah, and this is all a result of the ideological approach of realism, which is again protectionism.
Any updates from Morena?
Morena just opened essentially what is some welfare programs. One of them is a storefront. It's called the Tienda de Bienestar. They just opened their first one in Tijuana. Basically, it's the store where they're offering products that are controlled at controlled prices. This includes things like very cheap corn flour. They're selling very cheap toiletries. And they're also doing it specifically with businesses that have a heritage, meaning like they've been around for a long time and that have like good quality products. The Tijuana storefront for the first Tienda de Bienestar is a carniceria, which is a butcher that is around 50 years old. And it's really good for the community. People who are marginalized, who have access to these stores, and these stores are they're in areas where people are particularly poor. So if they're in an area where there's not a lot of economic resources, they're getting groceries at a much cheaper price. And they're salvaging businesses that like might not necessarily survive as a result of like all these trade wars and everything else and the economy. And they're giving them essentially government sponsorships to ensure that they're able to stay afloat. So it functions as a small business, more like a subsidy.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, they're giving people, you know, cheap, affordable household products, which includes agricultural products, as well as toiletries and things that you need around the house, and like
Mm-hmm.
cleaning supplies and stuff. And this is a part of a bigger program that monitors something called the Basic Basket in Mexico. And the Basic Basket encompasses everything that a human being needs to survive. And Mexico's goal is to raise the basic basket of every household to 2.5 baskets per household, so that people have a little bit of wiggle room and they have a little bit of money in between paychecks to be able to save potentially.
So they add those products to the butcher.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
see.
They're doing this with stores that are like having trouble staying afloat
Mm-hmm.
and that are potentially economically suffering as a result of like a variety of things. They're looking for businesses that are explicitly marginalized
Mm-hmm.
in marginalized locations to put these storefronts in.
So is the idea to have multiple?
Yeah, this is a pilot
Okay,
one.
I see. Okay,
Yeah, this is the
that's
first
cool.
that they're rolling out, and it's at Tijuana, which is of course a very marginalized
Yeah,
state. Did you hear about the corridos?
yeah, I did. I thought we liked our corridos.
Claudia Scheinbaum came out and she said that corridos. So this is on social media, by the way. She posted on TikTok where she said that corridos promote violence against women, drug use, a bunch of other themes. When asked, she didn't say that she was planning on banning corridos, which a lot of people in Mexico have acted like that's what she said, but she didn't say that she was going to ban corridos. Instead, what she said that is that the government is going to be platforming musicians, particularly women who make music that's like more wholesome, that's more artistic, that doesn't have so many themes that are associated with um narcotraficantes, which is narcotics and drug traffickers. I think that the reality is that narco corridos do glamorize a specific lifestyle that absolutely does cause harm, especially to the youth. And it does absolutely indoctrinate them into a process of believing and normalizing joining cartels as a way to like survive and like make a living in Mexico. And of course, whenever I talk about cartels, I have to mention that the United States is directly tied to creating these cartels, funding these cartels, giving them weapons, and all this other stuff. They're enlisting these youth to come and work for cartels through music because music is influential, whether we want it to or not. Here's the thing, though. I think that like corridos are a part of the story of a lot of Mexican people, and I think that story does deserve to be told. Maybe it doesn't need to be glamorized. This is also a part of the reality of Mexican people. So I'm not really sure what the solution is. I'm glad that she's not planning on censoring anybody. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been various musicians who have basically supported these efforts by not playing corridos. For example, at Coachella more recently, there
Mm-hmm.
was a Mexican musician who typically does play corridos but didn't play any of them. And there was another one in Mexico that refused to play them. The crowd rioted because he wouldn't play narco corridos.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that like a lot of people sort of viewed that and misunderstood it as a problem of sort of like a lot of these people were like in cartels or whatever, but I don't think that was the case. I think a lot of people are just really attached to stories of hope that are criminal because crime is the product of poverty. And I think when we think about it as a product of poverty, like people have to find ways to express stories and justifications for why they might engage in criminal activity. But anyway, those are my thoughts. And I love narco corridos. Personally, I love them, even though they are not good for the youth. I I understand that they're not good for the youth, but I also think that they sound really good. They remind me a lot of like how hip hop is sort of criminalized. It's just a reality that like a lot of people face.
Mm.
poverty and crime and having to resort to crime to survive. And I think those stories are worth telling.
On to our general topic. So this will be part 2 of our topic on the enemies of the left. You're going to want to listen to part 1, which we aired last week, where we talked about the evolution of white supremacy, defined a few terms like Natsosh and Patsosh. We also framed Zionism within the context of white supremacy. These are the people that are a little bit harder to identify as supremacists too. Like a lot of times, these people on the surface, they're like, they seem pretty with it, but if you dig into their history, you can see that like they're not actually aligned on a lot of things, but they know what to say.
Well, the
You
problem
know.
right now is that, like, okay, so there's two working problems. The first is that Palestinian people are actively being traumatized by some Jewish and some atheist Zionists. These are people who are explicitly white supremacists, but it's really hard to separate whether or not white supremacists, other white supremacists, are against them as Jewish people and with Palestinian people because they're actual anti-Semites. Do you get what I mean? So some pro-Palestine people who basically don't believe in Zionism and who vehemently oppose Zionism and oppose settler colonialism, but they also oppose Nazis, right? But for anti-Semites, it's really easy for them to use the pro-Palestine movement to disguise their anti-Semitism. So they'll basically
Mm,
say that like every single Jew is a Zionist. This is why like
mm,
conflating Zionism with Judaism is a mistake because honestly, it leaves Palestinians vulnerable because they are not able to aptly target their real enemy, who is the Zionist. The Zionist is the enemy. There are Jews that are anti-Zionist Jews, especially Orthodox Jews tend to be against the settler colony of Israel because it's actually against the Torah. So a lot of times they like completely oppose settler colonialism because they believe that their holy land is supposed to be miraculous and spontaneous, not as a result of genocide, because that's what the Torah says.
mm,
And then there are, of course, the American contemporary anti Zionist Jews, like Jewish Voice for Peace, who explicitly oppose the Israeli state, but they are Jewish people. It's
mm,
really easy to like have these white supremacists get enmeshed with the pro Palestine movement because they can just say that they oppose Israel. And that's what Ian Carroll is doing in particular. And Nick Fuentes does this too. Andrew Tate also does this. These are all right wing influencers who oppose Israel because they hate Jews, not because they support Palestine.
mm. I see.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's really convoluted, isn't it?
That's why I was saying it's hard to. Sometimes it's hard to identify a Patsosh, like initially. Like you really have to get through a few layers to see
Right.
that they're white supremacists.
Right. And that brings me to the American Communist Party. So the American Communist Party is just a bunch of patsoshes. They're a bunch of people who like believe in MAGA communism, meaning that like they believe in basically the Great White Replacement theory and they believe that communism should occur, but only for the white working class, not for the working class of color. And they fundamentally, like, whenever you bring up indigenous people to them, they either don't know how to react, they don't know how to talk about it because they don't want to say that, like, land back, because they're not real
Mm,
communists. Because real communists will be like, land back, like
yeah.
they'll immediately side with the indigenous working class because there's no other working class that's more working class than Black and indigenous people. That's like the best way to identify them is if they have no commentary about indigenous rights and
Mm,
indigenous land. And if you look at the American Communist Party's all of their propaganda, it's all of white people. Like really creepy old Herrenvolk era white people propaganda. They have a website. It's the
I'm
American
gonna look at
Communist
it.
Party website. A lot of communists think that the American Communist Party is a propaganda CIA operation to basically get people to defect from the real left.
Who? I mean, I'm trying to see if this is like if they're really like. in your face about it, because I can definitely see this being one of the situations like with the Nazi Socialist Party where they're
Oh no, oh my god, they're so not obvious with it.
oh
They have literal whole marches with people of color in them. Sometimes at the forefront too. They're really smart. They really put like people of color right at the front during the
uh-huh.
pro-communist rallies and stuff. But Jackson Hinkle and Midwestern Marks and a few other Pat Socias are their founders, and they are literally Nazis. Like literally, like if you go and look at their Twitters and stuff, you'll find that they talk about Jewish people in a really fucking gross way and like in a really gross light. And then you'll also have them talk about migrants in a really gross way and them talk about like indigenous people in either a complete absence or just like in a really gross way too.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, their website's really interesting. It's very like okay, so there's some stuff here that's like, oh, we support Gaza and unhoused people and all this stuff, but a lot of their stuff is like pro America.
Yeah. And what does that mean for the global south? That's another thing. Like, why don't they talk about the global south? Because they're perfectly fine with being an imperial MAGA type of communist country. And they're also pro Trump. A lot of them voted for Trump.
Yeah, I mean a lot of their material is very like this is like very Trump, very like militarized type militarized style marketing material, I will say that.
Yeah. Isn't it really interesting though? They're like
Yeah.
their way of like kind of disguising themselves
It's
and
like this yeah, it's like white supremacy in the 2025.
yeah, it's definitely cowardly because obviously they know that again, this goes back to like Harris, whiteness is property. These people know what they're doing is wrong,
Mhm.
but despite that they know that what they're doing is wrong, they're too afraid to come out and say what they really mean. Because really if they like if it wasn't wrong, they would just be like, yeah, we think that like America should just have like a white communist, they should just be a white communist country. So, yeah, and a lot of them truly do believe in the Great White Replacement theory. And that brings me to Zionism, which hopefully by now you've picked up that Zionism and white supremacy are they're twin sisters. They are this a lot of the times conjoined twin sisters because they are the same. And what I mean by that is that Zionism is incepted quite literally by Nazis. So the Lebensraum, which is the theory of the inception of Nazi Germany, which was safety for white people, was applied to Israel. It is safety for Jewish people, right?
Mhm.
And of course, the expulsion of Jewish people was required to create Israel. So the Nazis collaborated with defectors from the Jewish community who
Mhm.
were willing to collude with them to establish a white nation for Jews. And I want to emphasize white here because they are not kind to Black Jews, to Jews of color, and to other marginalized Jews,
Mhm.
including disabled Jews. So I think
Mhm.
that's important to demarcate here and really
Mhm.
like point out because they're also within even the system of Zionism, there is still definitely white supremacy, which I think says a
Mhm.
lot about what Zionism is and where it came from.
So I'm imagining that when Israel was created, when they had to cast away a certain group of Jews to Israel, they only allowed people who like met the criteria.
I wouldn't say that. I would say that it was more like Nazis wanted to get rid of the Jewish population
Uh-huh.
and Zionists were interested in creating a space that was economically beneficial for Jewish people,
Mm.
which meant the eradication of indigenous population. And again, this goes back to harm being reproductive.
Mhm.
And you mentioned this earlier that I was going to get into this when we talk about Zionism. But so you have, right, the European settler who is traumatized by the monarchy in Europe. And that's
Mhm.
why they come here to the United States and they reproduce their racism, their trauma, their bias upon the Black and Indigenous working class and create a slave class in the United States. The inception of Nazi Germany is quite literally influenced and an ideological daughter of the American Jim Crow era. So Hitler literally was like, hey, these people, they're a perfect model for what I want to do here in Nazi Germany. And in fact, the reason that Nazi Germany was vulnerable to this kind of ideology was because at the time in Austria, Austria was originally blamed for all of the crimes that happened during World War One. This forced what was to become the United Nations later. This forced the
Mm.
organization to impose a massive reparations payment schedule on Austria,
Mm.
which plunged them into a unfathomable debt. So they looked to migrants as a scapegoat to blame them for why the economy was bad.
Mhm.
And that is how the inception of Nazism and Hitler came to be. He was
Mm.
like, make Austria great again. He used images of wealth, of castles, images of white monarchy, and all of this sort of imagery to harken back to what Germany was like before the German mark was worth less than tinder for a fire.
Mm.
So when he did this, he rose to power,
Mhm.
and that reproduced onto the Jewish population. The Jewish population, who, by the way, was indigenous to Europe,
Mhm.
and they are expulsed, genocided, ethnically cleansed. They go to Palestine, where they then reproduce what they learned from the Nazis onto the Palestinian people.
Mhm.
We should be so lucky that we've studied history to this point and that Palestinian people are highly educated, because that makes them a lot less likely to reproduce the same problem onto other people after their ethnic cleansing and extermination.
Mm.
But they actually are, Palestinians are everywhere worldwide right now. So anyway, that's how it's reproductive, and that's what Zionism is. It's the literal daughter of the United States. Zionism and Nazism are
Mm.
daughters of the United
I think it
States.
might be helpful too to know that in terms of the timeline, um, when did Nazi Germany exist?
1930s.
1930s. Okay, so America was definitely like in it,
Oh
established,
yeah.
doing the slavery thing at that time too.
Oh yeah, in Jim Crow, so basically Jim Crow and Black codes are a series of laws after the Emancipation Proclamation.
Mhm.
Okay. So the Emancipation Proclamation, if I'm not mistaken, happened in 1863. We have the
Mm.
Emancipation Proclamation, which officially frees the slaves.
Mhm.
Jim Crow and Black codes, these laws were so brutal and so white supremacist still. Okay, so let me run it back.
Mhm.
Can you imagine Black folks are enslaved for 400 years at that point,
Mhm.
approximately, a little bit more than 400 years. And if you count Barbados, it's a really long period of time. Suddenly, they're no longer slaves. So their purpose in American and white society is completed. Less death happened under the enslavement of Black people than it did during Jim Crow, because the white supremacist viewed Black people as no longer necessary to
Mhm.
perpetuate the capitalist structure. So they began eradicating them,
Mhm.
like absolutely eradicating. So Jim Crow and Black codes, these segregationist policies, these apartheid policies, these were policies explicitly in place to ensure that the ethnic cleansing of Black and Indigenous people was continued and even
Mhm.
more brutal. That
Oh, okay.
that is how Nazi Germany gets incepted.
Yeah, they were like, I want that.
Right. And World War One happens in the early 1900s.
Mm.
So you have several years of war. Germany, what we now know as Germany, is plunged into debt. They see what's happening in the West, why
Mhm.
who they're putting to blame
Mhm.
for their poverty, for for the collapse of capitalism, because of course there was a huge collapse of capitalism during Reconstruction.
Mhm.
And then you see the inception of Nazi Germany.
Mm.
And then, so 1945 is the Second World War comes to conclusion. 1946 is the year of the Nakba, of the catastrophe of Palestinian people, the first and an original ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people.
Mm.
And that is also the inception. 1947 is the official inception of Israel.
I see. It's really helpful to get the timeline because it sometimes I know when people listen to this and when we talk about it, it seems like it was so long ago, but it wasn't that long ago.
No, there's a lot of this information
Less than 100 years.
is a lot of this information is still in living memory. I told you this
Right.
before, but my grandma remembers the inception. Well, my grandma, when she was alive,
Uh-huh.
she remembered the creation of Israel. She explicitly remembered it, and she talked to
Mm.
me about it on several occasions. She's like, "They're doing to the indigenous people of Palestine." I didn't know what she was talking about at the time, but
Mm.
now that I recollect, she was talking about the inception of Israel. She had a living memory of it when she passed away, and she was 111 years old. She was older than my grandfather when she died. Yeah, there were people who have living memory of the inception of Israel.
Mm.
It's useful to remember that there are still people who are alive who remember how old Israel was. And I say this also all the time. My home in Mexico is almost 200 years old. It's as old as the Emancipation Proclamation.
Mm.
It is older than the state of Israel by more than 100 years.
Mm.
There are still people who remember Palestine before the colonization.
Mm.
I think it's useful to talk about people who are people of color, who are the enemies of the left, that have adopted white supremacy, American capitalism, Americanism, nationalism, etc. And I feel like it's important to talk about migrants in particular that from places that we're from. I've already
Mm.
talked a little bit about Nick Fuentes, but can you
Mm.
share about like why Vietnamese people would be pro-America, for example?
Well, a lot of the Vietnamese people that came here after the Vietnam War were people who were experiencing a very destabilized country. Right after America pulled out, the communists took over, and there was just a lot of shifting and moving, and a lot of like killing for sure of anyone who they thought was associated with Americans. So that caused a lot of fear. That caused a lot of flight. We know about the boat people and refugees from Vietnam from that period of time. So a lot of the folks that ended up here, through the refugee system, carry a lot of that trauma, carry a lot of that um, towards the communists, because in their eyes, if the Communist Party had lost, that they would have a more democratic, quote unquote, Vietnam, something that more resembled America, or what they thought America to be, or the image of what they were sold America to be. We see this a lot in Orange County, especially Orange County, California. There's a lot of Vietnamese people down there that are very conservative, very pro Trump, very anti immigrants, um, and it's gotten better over generations. I think younger people are taking a much more nuanced approach. But part of the endorsement of this ideology, I think, comes from trauma. I think it's a trauma response for sure. I also think it's uh, a way that people have assimilated to living in America, right? Kind of like a way to live out this almost like romanticized idea of like, okay, if America had won, this is what my life would be like. Very, resentful, I think, of Vietnam.
What do you think Vietnamese people, particularly people who experienced the war on Vietnam, the genocide by the United States? So you already know this, but for our viewers, China intervened, right, on behalf of Vietnam to expel the Yankee.
Mhm.
And what do you think that happened that made some of them reject communism in particular?
I think it was poverty. I think they saw capitalism as a way out of poverty.
Do you think that any of them experienced physical, um, like physical repercussions from the war that might have made them anti-communist? Like, it's obviously like there's casualties on behalf of the Communist Party of China as well.
Mhm.
Do you think that that could have also radicalized them into the right?
I would say so. I mean, I think even in today's Vietnam, there is still a lot of pro-America and anti-China sentiment. I think this is also important to note that it was, the North Vietnamese versus the South Vietnamese. The North won, right? The war, the communist North. That was the side that was supported by China, and the South Vietnam was the side that was supported by America. So a lot of the refugees that came out were from the South Vietnamese people. I think that's partially why a lot of the folks that ended up over here are people who lost, like they were on the losing side, right? So they have a lot of resentment, they have a lot of anger um, towards China and towards communist Vietnam.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that the other thing is that like people when they're experiencing war and conflict, it doesn't matter whose side they're on, they just see violence.
Hmm.
Like they're just experiencing violence parsimoniously. There's no like political affiliation. Like people especially are not political inherently when they're experiencing violence. They're just experiencing violence and they
Yeah.
don't really care who it's coming from. And they're going to politicize it in the aftermath. And if the guns that went off were Chinese, they're going to be traumatized by that, even if they have the best intentions for the country. That's
Mm.
not me saying that they shouldn't do more research. That's not me justifying anti-communist sentiment in Vietnam, but that is me saying that like we should hold some space for people who experienced war.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it too has to do with education, right? Because it's like obviously America created the refugee situation, right? They really, but they also came and like offered refuge for the refugees that they created. So a lot of Vietnamese people are deferential to America for that idea of like, okay, America like saved us, America took us in, and now we're like in this land where we can engage in capitalism and improve the lives of our families and improve the lives of our children. That's what the American dream is, right? The one that is sold to most immigrants. I think that's also manufacturing the consent, right? Kind of similar to what we were talking about earlier around white supremacy being kind of a convenient excuse. I think this, and in some of the same ways, is also a convenient excuse, right, to explain why this happened to Vietnam.
Yeah, that also brings me, this is a good segue into gusanos, which is a slur for Cubans who fled the communist revolution in Cuba. And it means worm. I don't know if I already said that. It means worm in English.
Hmm,
Gusano means worm.
I didn't know that.
They were they were a group of people who were white. They were Spanish. They were post-colonial settlers, but they existed in Cuba and they were very wealthy landowners. So they were ideologically opposed to communism because their wealth was being threatened.
Hmm,
And they fled to the United States. So actually, during the elections, the most recent presidential elections, we saw a huge population of Gusanos who voted for Trump because they oppose socialism. They oppose communism in any kind
hmm,
and communist policy. And that means that they oppose liberalism because they associate it with communism. They think that it's a little bit more left. And because they think that, they are always going to vote right wing. And
hmm,
they're also like literally a plantation class. A lot of these white landowners were people who are descendants of plantation owners and who had slaves. So they are like apartheid. They're like the Cuban equivalent of apartheid South Africans.
hmm.
They're like people who,
They're like capitalist and unashamed,
yeah,
essentially.
literally. So you have like a Cuban population, and there are some, of course, who are brown people as well that have sort of ideologically attached themselves to white Cuban gusanos who believe in the same sort of pro-white, great white replacement theory stuff. This is the same stuff, really.
Mm.
Um, and then Mexicans are kind of unique in that our alt-right white supremacists are people who are ideologically tied to American capitalism because they believe that the empire is better than Mexico, with
Mm.
like completely discounting the fact that Mexico is in the underdeveloped stage that it is as a result of the American empire. And because they see more infrastructure, more development, no cartel here, they sort of assume that the United States is better for those reasons, that there's no like political corruption here. But in reality, they are doing political corruption. They're just doing it in Mexico.
Mm.
So they ideologically are pro America and white supremacists because they believe that white people do things better. And so they have a
Yeah.
lot of like chauvinist sort of ideas about Mexico, but also ideas that are like anti indigenous because they believe that indigenous Mexican people are inherently brutal or savage, even though they might themselves look very indigenous. They might have like
Mm.
a lot of indigenous heritage. We have those as well. And finally, we have the types that are fully Spanish, like they believe in, and this is true for Mexicans and Mexican Americans. We have the Mexican American who believes in Hispanidad. Hispanidad, by the way, means Hispanicism. Basically, they believe that it's powerful or good or like it's a merit to have a genetic history with the Spanish. So they're very prideful of like the Spanish side of their family and the Spanish coat of arms that their family comes from, that their family hails from, or whatever, with while completely ignoring the fact that the Spanish committed a genocide against indigenous Mexican people.
Kind of like the Confederate flag, huh? People are waving it proudly.
Yeah, well, it would be like if Native Americans did that.
Oh,
Yeah. So like it's like weird. It's very
yeah.
weird. And it's really unique to Mexican Americans because they're sort of removed from their indigenous identity to the point where like they don't fully understand that like they're basically saying like, "Yay, thank goodness my family in my family history I was forcibly miscegenated," which means sexually assaulted.
Mm.
Like I just want to be very clear that that's what that means.
That's some pretty deep internalized. You gotta really hate yourself to do that.
Well, you'd be surprised. A lot of them think it's benign. A lot of them don't necessarily think that it's white supremacy, that it's racism. A lot of them don't know that having pride in quote Spanish heritage is not a good thing for indigenous Mexican people. They don't understand. And this is again because they're removed. They live in the United States. And that is like a modern interpretation of a bastardized version of Chicanismo,
Mm.
actually. And that has a lot to do with like other political ideologies that are associated with that. But I just wanted to touch on that because that's where we come from, and those are the
Hmm.
kinds of sort of leftist traders that we have in our communities. But I also wanted to touch on one other because I feel like it's very complicated. And I think it's really important to talk about because a lot of people are confused whenever they see an Arab Zionist. And I just happen to know about this because I used to have a neighbor who talked to me about this. And I feel like he gave me probably the most comprehensive understanding of how they could happen, how they could occur. And there are various kinds of Arab Zionists, like there's Lebanese Zionists who have their own political stuff, but I'm going to talk about Iranian ones because that's specifically what I'm familiar with. But basically, Iranian Zionists, they are Zionists because they ideologically oppose Islam. And this is because Islam was used against them as a weapon. And we have the Iranian police, specifically the Basij, which is the religious police, who have absolutely horrifically treated their LGBTQI plus population. And to the point where the Iranian population has formed underground clubs and underground sort of like spaces to be queer in. And a lot of Iranians are reasonably traumatized by that. But
Hmm.
again, they're ignoring that the reason the Basij exist is because of color revolutions that happened in Iran on behalf of the United States. Meaning that like their government and the Basij and all of these like really exploitative, brutal empires and regimes, they're products of the United States. They're installed there and they're favorable to the United States too. And so they're Zionists because they believe in the Israeli project because they're against Islam, and Zionists are against Muslims.
It's really interesting because I feel like white supremacy has evolved so much from like the white pointed hat out of
Yeah.
white supremacy has really evolved into like something that is a little bit more subtle, a little bit harder to suss out. In response to leftism, right? In response to communism, the change in ideology.
Well, it also has a lot to do with the evolution of the American empire and its survival. So, this is like a natural deterioration of American capitalism and also an attempt for it to survive. Because I've said this to you before, conservatives believe in a white plantation class,
Mm,
right? They believe in the conservation of the old school system of capitalism, whereas liberals believe in a rainbow system of capitalism and enslavement, which is
mm,
why they expropriate their enslavement system abroad. That's why the Congolese people are being exploited and enslaved for minerals. There's still black slavery by the hands of the United States. It's just that now the plantation class can be other people of color as well. It can be anybody.
yeah.
Anybody can be a part of the plantation class. That aside, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that because I think it's important. But also, I'm going to get into the last couple segments here, if that's all right. So we touched on this very briefly, and we don't have a lot of time left on our podcast, but I do want to cover these topics because I think they're very important. So the alt-right pipeline, as we've covered, it's subtle now. It's subversive. It's totally evolved. It's a lot
Hmm.
more sleek. It's a lot more advanced, and it fits into narratives very neatly that makes it really easy to adopt. And things that I think that you should look for on people's profiles to identify white supremacists. First and foremost, if you are a transphobe, you need to fix your shit. Because guess what? Transphobes also happen to be white supremacists. Not all transphobes are white supremacists, but all white supremacists are transphobes.
Mm,
All of them. And I'm talking about explicit Nazis here, people who know that they're Nazis, not people who are microaggressive. I'm talking about people who, like Jackson Hinkle, Ian Carroll, Andrew Tate, all these people, transphobes. Hardcore transphobes, far right extremists. Like we're talking about extremists here. These people are fundamentally opposed to trans people and queer people because they believe, again, in the great white replacement theory. That's important to note. The
mm,
second thing is ableism. Hopefully, this is obvious, but if they are against disabled people, it's because they believe that disabled people's genetics are not superior,
mm,
and they associate that with transgender people, with people of color, with quote non-superior quote breeding. So if you oppose people who are disabled, or if you have ableism that you are still working on, work on it faster, work on it harder,
right.
because being ableist in the modern era means that you are very vulnerable to the white supremacist alt-right pipeline,
Mm,
very vulnerable to it. And then finally, hyper Christianity and the complete like prioritization of any Abrahamic religion is very bad for you. You will be put into the alt-right pipeline. We saw this with Judaism,
mm,
and we saw this especially, of course, with Christianity, white American Christianity, and its adoption by Nazis. Any extreme form of religion can be co-opted by the right and can be turned into a narrative that justifies the enslavement, the capture, and the dehumanization of the working class of color, and can absolutely turn into a violent narrative very quickly and very easily. And in fact, this is beginning to happen a little bit with Islam. We see this with Andrew Tate and a lot of far right content creators who are not even like, I would say that these are the types of Muslims who typically are also on board with Zionism. They're fine with Zionism as long as it doesn't affect their specific country. Like people like who like particularly people who live in like Saudi Arabia or Dubai, those
mm,
types of folks, they're perfectly fine with the extermination of another Muslim ethnic group as long as it's not them. Any hyper beliefs in any religion are not helpful, but especially Christianity, and I would say today, especially Judaism, any kind of like hyper beliefs where your religion has to be protected at all costs. Religion is a philosophy, it's not an ideology that you have to claw yourself into. And I know that that's a controversial take, and religion does enrich us. I will say that religion does absolutely enrich us, and I don't think that we should eradicate it. I don't think that that's right. And I do want to make a little caveat here that Islam is deeply marginalized right now. So we need to be careful when we talk about Islam and the hyper belief in Islamic ideals, because more often than not, these types of ideals get extremified. As always, any intersection is not static. It's it can absolutely change at any given point in time, as we saw the evolution of white supremacy.
What do we do with this information? Right. Okay. So we know about white supremacy now. We know about how people come into the white supremacy space, into the alt-right pipeline. How do we get out of it? Right. I almost feel like the alt-right pipeline is everywhere. There's so many landmines um, to walking into that space, or like slipping into that path. How do you know? Okay, so how do you know when you're in it, and how do you get out of it?
Well, I think that most people haven't really fully dealt with the fact that at its core, capitalism is sort of managing all of the other isms, right? That doesn't mean that one ism is more or less important than the other, but what it does mean is that capitalism functionally needs them to survive. So if you're a hyper capitalist, that's a really good indication that you're on the alt right pipeline, meaning that like if you support the American empire and your and the right of American people to survive over the global south, you are probably somebody who is well on your way to the alt right. So if you like overconsume, if you overproduce, if you believe in the exploitation of people because you own a job, if you are a landlord,
You're already there.
right, you're on the alt right pipeline.
Right.
And whether you want to believe that or not, there's no ethical landlord, there's no ethical cop, there's no ethical person who's in the military, right? You are somebody who's inherently on the alt right pipeline. You're on a fast track too. That being put aside, I would say that like the more subversive ways to tell that you're on the alt right pipeline is if you believe, for example, simplified concepts like the poor shouldn't have children.
Mm.
If you believe that poor people shouldn't have kids, you are on the alt right pipeline.
That's a good one. I've heard that a lot.
Yeah. If you use if you use filters to measure your face to see if it has the golden ratio, congratulations, you used a tool of eugenics and you are on the alt right pipeline. Another weird one is astrology,
Mm.
because astrology is the belief that stars govern your personality, which is very closely knit with the idea that genetics control your personality and thus the social construct around your quote unquote race. So there's these are more subtle ways, but basically the point is all of these are associated with supporting different components of white supremacy. And you don't have to be a white person to support them. Anybody can support white supremacy. Candace Owens is probably one of the strongest pillars of white supremacy in the modern era. She's really good at bringing people into the alt right, really good at it. And I would say that Clarence Thomas is another,
Mm.
completely and totally taking away the human rights from all women, regardless of what color they are, and explicitly sexually assaulting Black women. And he himself is Black, of course. So we have actors of every race, including Nick Fuentes, who, as I've mentioned before, he's Mexican and he is a white supremacist through and through, which is just absolutely wild because he's Mexican. And these are people who fundamentally found themselves on the alt-right pipeline because they have stereotyped ideas about their country, their people, and the world around them. And they haven't stopped to dissect what those ideas actually mean and what harm they're perpetuating. So that's how you identify whether or not you're on the alt-right pipeline, whether or not other people are joining the alt-right pipeline. There's a really good quote by Fannie Lou Hamer, my professor of sociology. She pointed out that this is actually a tactic. And the quote is by Fannie Lou Hamer. The tactic is we aren't free until we all are free. So if you believe that any marginalized person has to be sacrificed for your freedom, you are on the outward pipeline and you are not going to be able to get free. You are not going to be able to free yourself or other people because freedom should never come at the expense of anybody, including the global south. Particularly when we talk about these elections, and we've heard like these a lot of this rad liberal terminology where people are saying like, "Oh, well, we have to protect the people here at home." Well, every single people group in the United States has a counterpart in the global south that has it a lot worse. You can't tell me that Mexican people in Mexico don't have it worse than Mexicans in the United States. That's just a completely ignorant point of view. And it
Mm,
misunderstands what the United States is doing when it comes to the expropriation of its systems at large. So we have to always remember that we have privileges over certain people,
mm,
and we have to always identify what those privileges are before we identify our oppressions. Working within your privilege and understanding what your privilege is a lot more useful than working within how you are oppressed.
mm,
That's how we identify these types, and that's how we work together. And then finally, education is the answer. If you don't have a formal or informal education about marginalized people, who they are, what they look like, and what they suffer, then you won't be able to defend them.
mm,
Like, how can we defend the global south if we don't even know who's in the global south? What is a developing country? Why are they still developing? What's the history of that? And I'm not saying that every single person has to go and get a private IB education, but you should take some community college classes. You should absolutely go and read some pieces of literature from respected leftists in the field. And especially, you should research people who have said a lot about these things in the past. My favorite sociologist, he's also happens to be the first sociologist. He explicitly founded the field of sociology, was W.E.B. Du Bois. He was the first Black Harvard student, and he wrote a book on Reconstruction in the United States. He was alive during the Jim Crow South, and he went to Congo, and he actually got educated in Germany, and he was constantly communicating back and forth with Marx. So if you want a good place to start and learn about marginalized people specifically, and about like all of the intersections, like the global south, how Congo has been pillaged for literally hundreds of years, and how it's been pillaged not just for people as resources, but also for literal resources from then till now. It's really useful to understand like the plight of the global south. And yeah, education is the antidote to being on the all right pipeline.
mm. There's so much to this. I feel like we could have a whole series just on white supremacy.
Well, yeah, I really recommend that people take a class.
Yeah.
I think people should take a class. I think people should take a sociology class, particularly race and ethnicity 101.
Mm.
um and do research what professor's teaching it. Make sure that it's somebody of color, somebody who uses either Edward Said, Matthew Desmond's literature, Cheryl Harris if you're looking at more advanced sort of curriculums and stuff. And yeah, people who are talking about the ideological components of like the inception of white supremacy and like how it was created here in the United States.
Pervasive.
Yeah, it's absolutely so like it's so profound.
Yeah.
Thanks for tuning in to Liberacion Army Radio. This was episode 5 of our podcast. We released it on April 21st, 2025. We talked about 4chan, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, Blue Origin, The Flight in Space, Puerto Rico, Yemen, and Gaza. We finished off with the tomato situation and the Bienestar stores. And finally, we talked about The Enemies of the Left, Part 2. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you listen. Hope you come back next week to hear our next episode.
See you next week.